Happy New Year from the ISM Rochester chapter, and welcome to all of our members joining us today, including our students and all of our guests. I do have one announcement. I do want to mention that there will be a membership meeting next week, January 19th. It's going to be on our Zoom webinar platform. And the topic for this will be After 90 Seconds, Strategic Communication Skills Part 2 with returning speaker Lynn Wicklander, and registration will be sent out later today. Now on to our featured presentation. Please be sure to ask any questions using our chat or Q&A function. We do want this to be an interactive event. Our speaker for today is Stephen Carnovale. He has a Ph.D., is a professor of supply chain management at the Saunders College of Business at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Prior to joining RIT, he was the Nike Professor of Supply Chain Management at Portland State University. He earned his BS and PhD degrees at Rutgers University, specializing in supply chain management and marketing sciences, and is a frequent speaker at both academic and professional supply chain meetings on topics related to supply networks and analytics, with a specific focus on how firms can use concepts to generate enhanced visibility and financial performance within their supply chains and extended enterprises. He is also the co-editor-in-chief at the Journal of at the Journal of Purchasing and Supply Management. We are so very thrilled to have you presenting this important topic today. Please welcome our speaker, Dr. Stephen Carnovale, to the stage.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's a pleasure to be back, albeit virtually, with everybody. I was talking to Kathy before this. It's kind of funny, you know, I've done a number of presentations for the ISM Rochester chapter. In the first part, when I got here, they were mostly in person with those lovely rubber chicken dinners. They're actually better than that because we have pretty good restaurants around here, but looking forward to being able to meet with everybody in person again. But I'm happy to be here today virtually, and it's an interesting topic that we stumbled upon here. So we're going to be talking about risk management, which is, some of you know, is my area of academic research. But the topic today is risk management from a whole different lens. It's about intellectual property. So how this came about was kind of an interesting thing. But first thing I want to mention, though, this report and what you're seeing here is property of, and the copyright is owned by the National Bureau of Asian Research. They were the sponsor of this project. I was the principal investigator on the project. So nothing can be shared without express written consent. I've gotten permission to distribute the recording after this meeting, of course, and I've told Kathy that. But please do refrain from screenshots or anything like that. A full copy of the report has been released. So if anybody wants that, it's freely available on the National Bureau of Asian Research's website. And that gives you the comprehensive overview of everything. And just let me know, I can send you the link. But this came about right before COVID started, or it could have been right in the beginning of COVID. And one of my former students from Portland State approached me and said, "Hey, I've got a friend at the National Bureau of Asian Research, and they're doing something with digital supply chains. I think you'd be interested in." And I ended up talking with them, and the topic was about intellectual property, which I immediately saw as a risk management opportunity, at least a way in which to hedge potential threats and risks to the supply chain. So what we ended up doing for the report is we sought out information, and we did semi-structured interviews with 3 different groups of executives. And the way I kind of broke up the way to look at this was through the sourcing function, through the manufacturing and operations function, and through the logistics and distribution function. So 3 different groups with 3 different expertises. And basically what we were trying to address, and with all those groups, we had I had the same interview protocol. But I was trying to address basically 3 different questions. One, which parts of the supply chain are the most vulnerable and what can be done to secure them? What's the current state of technology in order to address these problems of supply chain intellectual property protections? And what best practices can we leverage? And so everything was under what's called the Chatham House rules. So everybody can take information away, but they can't explicitly say, you know, who was there and what companies and what roles and anything confidential. But the context of all this is that basically, and I don't have to tell anybody here this, I just like to accentuate the fact that every time we say that supply chains are global, they get more global, right? I mean, COVID dramatically introduced the fact that supply chains are complex, that most of the manufacturing, the bottleneck parts and the critical parts are produced and procured and assembled overseas. And, you know, it used to be regional, like you take the Rust Belt with cars, right? You had your brake supplier or your tire supplier in Akron, your brake supplier in Cleveland. It was all getting shipped to Detroit. Now you've got your tire supplier in Tianjin, and you've got the assembly plant in Hanoi. It's just crazy complex. So regional has moved to global. This obviously is done for cost reasons, but it increases exposure, increases complexity, increases risk. And so this is the breakdown of, I think it's a 737 airplane. And so when you look at the bill of materials, just the level one, okay, there's 23 level one subassemblies, 14 tier one suppliers over 10 different countries for one product. You can imagine how complex that bill of materials gets as you move forward or as you move down in each of these subassemblies. So this right here to me screams risk. And that's kind of the lens that I look at everything. But think about the intellectual property involved with manufacturing, anything in the aerospace, anything in defense, anything in tech. In some cases, you know, I was in Vietnam in 2017, and we saw these assembly plants for handheld devices. Could have been beard trimmers or hair trimmers, or it could have been iPhones, Apple, Samsung, whatever. The assembly plants, the assembly lines are right next to one another. So it becomes murky as it relates to intellectual property, but this complexity opens up vulnerabilities. And that's the key thing that we discovered, or at least that's what kind of started the report in and of itself. But what exactly is intellectual property? Intellectual property, generally speaking, are human creations or creations of human intellect, tangible or intangible. So things like the patent for a new phone, trade secrets, right? You know, there used to be this commercial for Bush's Baked Beans where it'd be the guy and the dog, and then the secret recipe was locked in the back of a safe somewhere, right? That's a trade secret. That's a recipe. It's not patentable, but it's intellectual property nonetheless. And now you're seeing things like non-fungible tokens and all these goofy new age, high-tech, intellectual property driven products. And that's what we're talking about. Now, just step back for a moment and consider how much of that exists in the supply chain. I mean, really think about the relationship that OEMs have with their suppliers, tier one, tier two, et cetera, and think about co-engineering, co-design, and co-development. Think about the amount of tech and IP that's shared across the supply chain. And this is a big deal, particularly as we go back to the idea that supply chains are really global. Reason being, a recent report by AmCham Shanghai, which is the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, they did a survey of their membership, and 50% of the foreign companies operating within China thought that, quote, a lack of IP protection and enforcement is a hindrance to their business. Now, of course, it was higher in some industries than others, pharma, medical devices, as you might imagine. But this is huge because the annual losses in terms of theft or leakage, as it were, over $300 billion. That's huge, right? That's the comparable to the level of exports almost between the US and China. So it's a massive issue. Then you take all of this, which was existing prior to COVID, and you bring on the fact that COVID exacerbated cybercrime, cyber theft. This is a recipe for disaster. And as a matter of fact, the recent Section 301 report, which is a Commission on IP, does this for the World Trade Organization. They estimate that the cost of this theft is between either 225 and $600 billion annually. So everybody's got a different idea on the cost, but it's massive, okay? Big issue in the supply chain, particularly when you think about the complexity associated with it. So again, these are the three questions that we were looking at. What parts are most vulnerable and what can be done? What's the state of the technology? And what are the best practices? And as we progress in the presentation, I'm going to go through each one of these buckets. So the thing that we did, having these three different groups with 9 different people in total, It was a semi-structured interview, which meant it was really a conversation between me and everybody. And a lot of ideas tended to emerge. And it was my job as the researcher to aggregate, distill, and then distribute, or at least codify this information. And one of the things that kept coming up across every single group with whom we spoke was this human factor. And this was a great quote from one of the panelists. It says, the IP resides in the individual, and there is a problem with this. The weak link in the chain is when the guards let them through. The human factor is key. So every single person in every single group alluded to, either directly or indirectly, to the fact that the people are the problem. And, it makes perfect sense, right? Because anytime we engage in a contract, right, let's say we're starting with a new, if I sign someone on as a consultant, they're bringing me on as a consultant, I'm going to sign a non-disclosure agreement, right? I'm going to sign all these confidentiality provisions, and that's codified, legal, and enforceable. But think about how rapidly something spreads online. Legalese is used, but it's not sufficient, right? I could put the patent or the schematics or whatever the case of IP that I'm talking about, I could put it online and 15 million people could download it within 2 days, much quicker than the company could sue me. And could they win? Absolutely, they could. But the point is, the IP is already gone. It's already out there. You think about that, and then you think about the touch points associated with IP. Think about how many intermediaries are involved in any layer of the supply chain, right? As we develop complex products, it's even more complex. More people have access to cloud computing, tech. It's everywhere. These expansive networks, while bringing down the cost and increasing flexibility, they also engender risk as it relates to leakage associated with IP. And so this is an example here, but a consultant relationship that person was being brought on in order to work on a specific thing. There was a non-disclosure. There was a non-compete, all the legalese, the contractual, everything was buttoned up perfectly. But the whole point of the consultant was really to subvert the technology, steal it, and then send it back to a different firm. And you can see here, the consultant was going to be paid $1,000 a day for a 15-day visit. When it was found out that the whole goal was to take proprietary information and throw it back to their real employer, there was a $5 million fine and an imprisonment. Huge problems here. And this isn't new, right? It's newer now that we're talking about it, but there's examples of this going back to when the East India Tea Company was going back and forth intercontinentally, and tea recipes were being pilfered, right? Illegally being, espionage, corporate espionage. And this has birthed a whole slew of books, fiction novels, but it's a big deal. So the human factor, no matter what element of the supply chain that we're talking about, the human factor came through as a big deal. Okay, this was the weakest link. As you transition into each of these elements, it's perfectly fitting that I'm giving this presentation to the Institute for Supply Management, because sourcing, as I'm going to make the case, has the largest vulnerability, but it has the largest opportunity, in my opinion. And so when we talked to the group with sourcing, one thing kept coming up. I mean, multiple things kept coming up, but the common tenet was that traceability is key, because it doesn't really exist, not in earnest. There were great examples that we came across about carbon fiber being a huge component to a number of different products, but there's no way to trace it. So when something enters into the supply chain, if it's not traced, you have questions of product authenticity, product quality. And so one of the things that the panelists said, things that aren't traced, like raw materials, they're most vulnerable, as well as anything that has variability in price. So think about things like commodities, right? If you're buying gold, silver, precious metals, frozen concentrated orange juice, coffee, you take your pick. Price fluctuations engender the procurement professional to try to secure a lower cost source of supply, obviously, when you can, when it's an option. But this also opens up opportunities for issues. And I have this Tesco example. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with it, but the story is, and it's a really compelling one from a traceability standpoint. The Irish government, a number of years back, was doing quality controls, and they randomly sampled a number of different products in order to genetically test whether or not the source of whatever the product claimed to be was authentic. And they had inadvertently found that what was being advertised as beef wasn't beef. Some was pork, some of it might have been horse, etc. So this unraveled a huge scandal, and they said, wait a minute, if pure meat products are being sold as one thing and actually another, this could be everywhere once you look at the structure of European food supply chains. And so this Tesco spaghetti bolognese, they did genetic testing on it, and they found it was supposed to be beef. It was explicitly, listed right there. You can see it, beef, no artificial flavors or colors, which I guess is kind of true. The only artificial part was it wasn't beef. It was mostly horse. It was something like 60% horse, and then some beef sprinkled in. Well, I don't know about you, but if I'm a quality control person at the beginning of this supply chain, I think I know what the difference between a horse and a cow looks like if I'm sending them to slaughter. The point is, traceability leads to huge issues, the reputational risk that happens, the quality risk. And then once this Tesco thing popped up, IKEA got hit with this, a number of different other Carrefour, a supermarket in the UK, got hit with it. So it becomes a big issue. And the reason why all this can happen is there aren't any industry standards to govern inputs insofar as IP infringement, trade secret infringement, fraudulent product and quality concerns, huge deal. So pharma actually is probably the most forward thinking of all industries on this. The Obama administration signed into law huge pharmaceutical protection acts because I think it was over 60% of the generic pharmaceuticals that we get in the States come from overseas. And obviously with pharma, there's big potential for harm if it's not done correctly. Counterfeit goods are a big deal. Some of you that know me know that I'm a big cigar guy. Counterfeit goods, they're not only in the cigar supply chain. I mean, they are everywhere. I used to walk as a kid up and down Canal Street in New York City, and I would see all the different vendors having, $10 Louis Vuitton bags that obviously weren't Louis Vuitton bags, but boy, did they look like them. So this kind of counterfeit goods element echoed what was said about transparency. And really what kind of bubbled up from this was that there isn't enough information sharing between parties in the supply chain. And there wasn't really a great standard to verify authenticity in a number of cases. I mean, with some things you can do it, but with raw materials like tobacco, beef, this, that, it becomes really challenging. As a matter of fact, it's a massive economic impact as well. One estimate popped up suggesting that the counterfeit goods cost the US economy $600 billion a year, which at the time when the estimate was done was about 3% of GDP. But think about what ends up happening if a company puts in fraudulent products into the supply chain. There's warranty issues, there's quality risk. It's a big deal. And that's all at the beginning of the supply chain, right? As procurement professionals, that's the thing that we're all thinking about here is how do we mitigate that risk in the beginning? Yeah, there's a cost-focused perspective. Everyone thinks about cost when they think about procurement, but there's also a quality-focused perspective, and there's the strategic element to ensuring continuity with respect to sources of supply. When we transition into the manufacturing, we're presupposing that what was done in the prior step of the supply chain, the sourcing element of the supply chain, was done correctly, or at least with some verifiable quality mechanism in place. When we look at manufacturing, product quality was the biggest risk that our panelists identified. And from one particular person with 40 years experience in the automotive industry, what they mentioned was that from the automotive side of things, fraudulent products were the biggest issue, particularly when joint ventures pop up. So going back to my Boeing example, in 2017, when I was in China, I was able to go to a Boeing factory. It was a joint venture between a Chinese company and Boeing, and they were producing elements of the fuselage, which I thought was kind of interesting. It seems like, less than, it's an important part of the airplane, obviously, but it's a less high-tech part of the airplane. And then I realized now, reflecting back, the reason why is there wasn't that much IP to siphon off, right? There was less risk of that particular part of the plane their IP being siphoned off. But this issue has popped up in a number of different ways. The Takata airbag recall is the best one that I can think of, and I'm sure people on the call might have experienced this. The story is that Takata is the company who produced the airbags, and they were a first-tier supplier to Honda, Toyota, BMW, a number of different automotive manufacturers. And when this happened, this issue, it was a result of really someone being deceptive, but there was a chemical from a procurement side of things that went into the mixture in order to make the airbag pop on impact. Well, the particular chemical switch that they made was of a lower quality. And what ended up happening was when that lower quality product got exposed to heat fluctuations or temperature fluctuations, it could go off, especially with different levels of humidity, which is exactly what happened. So there was these faulty airbags, which caused huge, obviously personal risk to people, but the financial risk, this ended up bankrupting Takata, the first tier supplier to all these OEMs, and it caused huge legal risk. I mean, again, I'm sure some of you on the call might have even been personally impacted by this. It was a big deal, but it was a theft of IP. It was a trade secret that went wrong, and fraudulent product got introduced into the supply chain that just really damaged it, which led to brand image issues. And this was a thing that I hadn't even thought about, but the example that we're looking on the screen here, that pair of sneakers right there, I'm not a sneaker guy, I buy Asics, I've been wearing Asics for years, but I'm told that the authentic product from which this fraudulent product was modeled after is something called a Yeezy by Adidas. And these shoes apparently sell for a number of $100s. As you can see, the price here, $15.99. So to the uneducated eye, that sneaker looks exactly like the one that's a couple $100s more, but it's being sold for $16. And we all know we can drill down the cost of manufacturing of that and shipping that maybe for $10, right? So whoever's reselling that is probably making, before commission from Amazon, $6 a shoe. But they're doing it off of the back of the person who owns the intellectual property, the company, Adidas in this case. And so what ended up popping up, why I put this as an example, it's a social media and a brand issue. That's what our panelists identified. So they said these platforms that are popping up, right? And they're talking mostly, the person that we spoke to was mostly business to consumer, but think about reverse auctions or any other type of e-procurement from a B2B side of things. It's crazy. Companies have been having issues associated with this for a number of years now, but with platforms, the IP infringement has been crazy. And you can see this in some examples, right? Where, Omega, the premium watch company, they've recently made a move to disintermediate. They don't sell through, in many cases anymore, secondary retailers. They own their own shops, kind of like Apple made a big push a number of years back to own their retail stores. Now, they have presences in other places, but they're very selective in how they do it, right? They're not a retailer where they'll sell to anybody who's selling, and once it's off their books, it's off their books, because it's really not. It's an IP issue at a certain point, and having control over that is quite important. And also, and this is going to pop up, data security ended up being a thing, not only in the manufacturing side of things, but also, as we're going to see in a moment, on the logistics and distribution side of things. We spoke to somebody who basically identified the fact that everybody tapping into common databases, either for joint engineering, joint product development, research and development, accessing schematics, 3D printing, anytime there is a cloud in which critical information is stored and then thereafter disseminated or at least accessed by multiple people, there's huge vulnerabilities that pop up. So all these different touch points, I mean, this IoT example is a great one. And in the conversation, we got into some really fascinating discussions, but all these different touch points where you can remotely access information, which might be or likely is proprietary information, huge risks end up popping up, particularly as it relates to theft and leakage of IP, being able to access things that you probably shouldn't, having access to different levels of information and schematics. And then think about, what a malevolent actor could do, take that, either sell it or ransomware. I mean, all these kind of things, it's wild when you start peeling back the onion, how detailed it can get actually. And this transitioned really well into the logistics space, where data security and product guardianship were the two things that popped up. And so basically what they told me was logisticians or people moving product, these are the folks who are guardians of the information implicitly. And, you can look at Incoterms, right, where you have FOB, FAB, you own it when it gets 30 degrees up and this and that. I mean, all the crazy terms that we can come up with for who owns what when. The point is it's being moved. And once it's in some type of conveyance, it becomes vulnerable, particularly coupled with IoT and tech-driven logistics innovations. And so the thing that we talked about in this particular focus group, imagine you've got a pallet of something where the sensor on that pallet is really advanced. Maybe let's say it's detecting gas levels in fruit that's being transported from the West Coast to the East Coast. Think about how a malevolent actor could get in and not only understand what the routing is, because, you know, from a logistics standpoint, my network design, my routing, my scheduling, that's my IP. I'm optimizing my network, my distribution network. If I'm Amazon, is the reason why I have such high OTIF. This is the thing that I'm judged on beyond anything else, aside from availability. Is, am I getting the product at the right place at the right time, the right price? Well, as you move products and as you incorporate more technology into products, ultimately, you expose yourself to theft of IP. Now, hopefully you don't have anything within that sensor that can kick off too much proprietary information, but it can happen. Then you think about, and one of the panelists mentioned this about global security events, the pivoting into thinking about security, yeah, absolutely, it's peaked up. But as we increase the amount of emphasis we're placing on security, we realize how much is actually exposed. That was one of the things. So as the Internet of Things pops up, these IoT sensors, informatics, these new attack vectors for malevolent actors pop up, and it becomes really crazy to think about. Another wild example I'll leave you within the medical device space. A pacemaker, for example, can be, you know, in the old school, my grandmother had one. She had to, like, you know, with the phone, you'd dial up a number and then you'd hook up the thing to it and it would send some kind of signal through the phone. Now I can probably control a pacemaker if I'm a physician from my phone or my computer. Think about how you could get into somebody's actual physical body, you know, and pull information from that, or God forbid, do something malevolent to them. So, you know, it's this double-edged sword with tech coming in, helping us out in a number of different ways. It also opens up so many different attack vectors and different vulnerabilities that previously we weren't thinking of. So that's the problem. Those are the areas in which we found the largest risk. What's the state of technology? Really, there's three things that popped up. There was cybersecurity protections, there was blockchain technology, and there's artificial intelligence. And here's a selfless plug, or a selfish plug, I guess I should say, shameless plug, for a recent book that myself and a colleague put out on cybersecurity and supply chain management. But cybersecurity is huge. Supply chains are digital right now, right? I mean, the physical analog moves product, but the digital supply chain is what moves information, money, and facilitates that physical supply chain. So what are some recommendations? What can we do? And we're going to talk a little bit about this in a moment, but basically encryption. That's something that not a lot of people think about, like how essential it actually is. But for, you know, a MacBook, let's say, which I'm giving this presentation on, encryption has been built in. Think about all the data that you have sitting on servers, working with suppliers, sharing information. Is it encrypted? Are there protocols to access it? Have you done stress tests? When you did your onboarding for your suppliers, was cybersecurity a thing you talked about? You know, cyber insurance policies pop up, but they're so limited in how they'll respond to different crises. It really is incumbent on the owner of the IP to protect it, and cybersecurity and data security become really important. Blockchain. Blockchain has been popular since Bitcoin has been popular, and blockchain is the underlying technology. Some of you might remember the panel that I organized for the joint meeting between ISM Rochester and Apex. But blockchain essentially is a distributed ledger technology. It is a digital record which is immutable and accessible by everybody, and effectively it can govern traceability. You can see anytime a transaction has been happened, you can see the full record of that transaction. Blockchain could be and has been to a certain degree incorporated in product traceability. With the vaccine development, it actually popped up to a great deal because you need to have security and IP. I mean, think about how important the IP is around vaccines. There was a global race on who would develop the vaccine, right? But smart contracts that can govern relationships and transaction and precedence on discovery, Blockchains can be able to authenticate IP if they're conducted, organized correctly. Evidentiary claims of ownership, who actually owned it, who made it first, right? Trade secrets and trademarks and things like that, copyrights. Artificial intelligence is kind of a newer thing. I think the application that we're going to see most initially is probably on detection of fraudulent products, something that can scan Amazon's listings and say, this product looks like my actual product and it's not, and it's being sold for a price that's totally different. But detection, and basically it's automating things that humans could do in a much faster way. You might have seen some stuff pop up with Facebook or other social platforms leveraging AI in order to be able to detect hate speech or something like that, content which shouldn't be on the platform. That's where you're going to see artificial intelligence really shine as it relates to intellectual property. So what can you do about all this? What are some best practices? There's a three-pronged approach: detection, mitigation, and recovery. How do we prevent issues before they arise? Inevitably, when they pop up, how can we, deal with the fallout? And then the recovery piece is, how do we return to the pre-disruption state? The detection piece, cataloging all IP, knowing where it is, allowing for those cyber protections, those computer protections, anything to hedge against a potential breach, really enumerating what all the breaches are before they happen and thinking about how you can guard them. People keep safety stocks of cash to protect against financial emergencies, safety stocks of food to prevent against hunger. We've got to think about our IP in the same lens. How do we prevent these issues before they pop up? And I think what's necessary is sort of an ISO standard for IP, because currently they don't exist. But I think from the sourcing side of things, make it a priority during supplier selection, scorecard against whether or not IP protections have been adhered to. From a mitigation standpoint, this pivots really into the core cyber hygiene of it all. This is what we're talking about. We need to make sure that we use NIST frameworks and best practices associated with data security in order to protect against inevitable disruptions to our intellectual property. And then from the recovery standpoint, how we get back to that pre-disruption state, a lot of this is parallel with good sourcing strategy, redundant suppliers, or at least a supply base that's flexible enough to adapt, right? Not everything located in Wuhan in China. If I'm an electronics manufacturer, like many were when COVID hit, that were completely disrupted. Now that's the classic supply chain disruption, but you can think about if your IP is disrupted, one manufacturer is producing a particular subcomponent, the product the IP got stolen, now they're shut down. Can we pivot to another manufacturer to keep continuity of business? Backup and redundancy systems and contingency plans, a priori legal strategies for when this inevitably happens. How can we react? How can we govern this? So that's the best practices that we found. And you can read more about this in the report more comprehensively. But basically, it's a detection, mitigation, and recovery, a classic risk management approach applied to intellectual property. So what can I say to conclude all of this? Unfortunately, I don't have great news. It's a big problem, and so I think only going to get worse. In my mind, I think sourcing has the most to gain and the most to lose by protecting or not protecting IP, as it were. And I think this really can be the total quality management of the 2020s if collectively, as procurement professionals and academics, we act on this kind of thing. So it's been my pleasure. Very grateful to be here. I encourage anybody to have, if you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat or some other type of function. I think we've got some comments here. Let me take a look and see if anybody has some questions.
Wanda, you have your hand raised. Would you like to talk live? Just let me know. And I'm going to allow you to talk right now so you can ask your question. Oh, I think she lowered her hand. If anybody has a question, please put it in the chat or the Q&A. And because we have Stephen here live to answer your question, or if you have any comments about the presentation.
Yeah, and of course, I encourage anybody to email me with questions. If you'd like to chat about this at any time, I'm happy to. In the meantime, I'm going to find the link for the report and put it in the chat. That way everybody can see it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you could put that in the chat. That would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of information, so I think people are just taking in all the information that you just presented.
Yeah, it's thick. There's a lot to it for sure.
Yeah, I'm always astounded by some of the studies that you came up in especially the frozen meat one, that frozen package one, really astounding.
Yeah, boy, the Tesco example, and you can take a look at one of my one of the citations in the presentation. It's wild the degree to which the fraudulent food, because part of it, what ended up happening, Tesco is a major retailer in the UK and a number of other places in Europe. So when they go to make their private label stuff, they do what anybody who's going to do private label does. They find a contract manufacturer, and that contract manufacturer ends up procuring products from wherever they do. So, you know, you're already on a private label side of things. So you're trying to transition to a lower cost alternative to a brand name. So the contract manufacturer knows that. You have the RFP that you agree to the price per unit or per pallet, whatever it is. And then from there, they have to go back and secure the supply. So they're looking for low-cost supplies on meat, low-cost supplies on tomato sauce, low-cost supplies on everything. And it ripples backwards. And so when cost pressures pop up, that the subversion of those process-based controls happen like crazy. And ultimately, you know, it causes kind of an issue, kind of a risk. Looks like Ted's got a question. What about putting information on portals as opposed to just mailing information? Yeah, so that's a good question, Ted. So that was one of the things where the vulnerabilities popped up. You know, you think about like old spy movies where people would pop up with a little James Bond kind of camera in their shoe and, you know, take a picture of design schematics in an office. Now, because they're digital, theoretically, you can add layers of security that previously you couldn't, but people get around those layers of security all the time. And multiple people can use what's called brute force algorithms to be able to just try and bypass the security, you know, and then ultimately access them. In the cybersecurity landscape, one of the things that works really well, surprisingly, is wide-scale phishing emails. And some of them are obvious phishing emails. Others really aren't that obvious. One that popped up to us that was remarkable was a giant blast associated with something having to do with pay raises. And the email looked really official. It had the name of the person who would normally, you know, judge your pay raise and this and that. And it looked official. The email looked official. And it turned out that once you opened up the attachment to the email in order to schedule your appointment with whomever you needed to speak, it was like a ransomware that popped up onto your phone. So, you know, in RIT, we've been hit with a couple of these spam email attacks. Luckily, we have pretty good mail servers, but some get through, you know, it's wild. So all told, the portals are great in theory, but those protections and securing them need to be adhered to, especially if you're in like the government contracting side of things, or if you interface with the federal or state and local government. It becomes a big deal. You know, the other thing I'll leave you with in terms of how hacking can pop up in a really malicious way is the Target cyber breach. One of the biggest cyber breaches over the past 10 years, about 8 years ago now, to 2015. That happened because of an HVAC contractor at a local, I think it was in Pittsburgh. They needed to do some work on the local Target, and the way that they got paid was through Target's ERP system. Well, the HVAC company, didn't pay for the premium version of the antivirus software, and then a malevolent actor was able to access Target software through that. So it pops up all the time. It's pretty crazy. Pretty crazy. Yeah, there you go. Catching them after hours, taking pictures of engineering. That's exactly right. We used to actually see that when I would give presentations early on in my academic career, given presentations of my research. We would see people that we'd never seen before taking pictures of our slides, you know, and it was just, on the one hand, I was flattered to think that I was doing something important enough to be stolen by somebody. But on the other hand, I was like, hey, you know, that's my work. Stop taking, you know, you take pictures of me if you want, but maybe not the work. But anyway, it's a great point, Ted. Thanks for the comment.
We do have one question in. Can you briefly describe the main components of the digital supply chain?
Yeah. So the digital supply chain, you think about what happens in a traditional supply chain. What are we moving? We typically think about products, but there's two other elements that support that physical movement of products, which are information and financial. So those two elements of the supply chain are critical. Things in the digital supply chain that we talk about now are digital assets like information on schematics and production technologies, digital assets. So if we're doing something in the software side of things, also, if you think about a company like Amazon, yeah, they have a huge physical supply chain, but really their digital supply chain are cloud servers, cloud computing capacity, plans, all these kind of things. So the best way to think about the digital supply chain is simply think about the regular supply chain and then think about those intangible elements that are moving back and forth, or at least that support the physical supply chain. So that's the best way to think about it. And that's the biggest area where fraud and theft and deception on a number of different areas, not just IP, pop up for sure.
Okay, I don't see any other questions or comments. Do you have any closing remarks for the group?
No, I just want to thank everybody for listening to me blather on for 43 minutes at this point, and hopefully I get to see everybody in person at I forget the restaurant that serves the best chicken French in Rochester, although I think that's a hotly contested question. Nonetheless, I do hope that we can all meet again in person soon, and thanks for having me today.
Well, we appreciate you coming and talking about this really, really important event, and this information is like so hot off the press as well, because I believe you released it in December.
Yeah, the report got released mid-December, and we did a launch presentation on it. And then at the end of this month, beginning of February, we're going to be doing some briefings to some members of Congress about this as well. So yeah, good stuff.
Oh, very good. Very good. Oh, thank you so much again for joining us today, Stephen. Thank you to all of our members, guests, and students for participating today as well. And we hope everybody has a great afternoon. And I will send information on our next event later today. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Take care.